Hello and welcome friends. Grain whiskey ordinarily refers to any whiskey made from grains other than malted barley, such as whiskey made using maize, corn, wheat or rye. Grain whiskies can also contain some malted barley. Whiskey made from only malted barley or primarily from malted barley is typically called malt whiskey rather than grain whiskey, although barley is a grain. Most American whiskies and Canadian whiskies are grain-based. Single grain whiskey is whiskey or whiskey made in a single distillery from unmalted grains, most often barley, corn or wheat. The vast majorities of single grain whiskies are produced in Scotland and are therefore single grain Scotch whisky. To be labelled as such, the finished spirit must be produced solely in Scotland, matured for a minimum of 3 years in oak casks of a capacity not exceeding 700 litres and have a minimum alcoholic strength of 40%. The production of grain whiskey commenced in Scotland in the 1830s. Today there are only 7 grain distilleries left in the country compared with well over 100 malt distilleries. Grain whiskey is cheaper and easier to produce than malt whiskey. It is made in continuous column stills rather than pot stills, which allows much of the distillation process to be automated, reducing overheads. A number of high-quality single-grain Scotch whiskies are now available and are held in the same esteem as the finest single malt Scotch whiskies. The better-known examples include Cameron Bridge, Port Dundas and Jim McEwan's Celtic Heartland. These fine single grain whiskies are smoothly textured with oak-derived notes of vanilla, caramel, coconut and spice.
Scots have been making whisky for over 500 years. It's a skillful process and one that whisky makers have refined over the centuries. Malt whisky is made by what is called the pot still process, which involves malting, fermenting, distillation and maturation. The first step is to malt the barley, where it's steeped in water, and then traditionally spread out on a malting floor and allowed to germinate. Today, modern high-tech maltings serve the same purpose, preparing the starch in the barley for fermentation. The malting process lasts about a week until germination is stopped, by drying the cereal in a large oven called the kiln. Once the barley is dry, the malt is ground in a mill, and the crushed grain, called grist, is mixed with hot water in a mash tun. The starch in the malt is broken down and creates a liquid called wort. The wort is transferred into large vessels called washbacks, where yeast is added. The yeast causes fermentation of the wort, creating alcohol. This is known as wash. The wash is distilled twice in distinctive copper pot stills. First in the wash still and then in the spirit still. These act like large kettles, heating the liquid. The alcohol vapors rise and pass over the top of the wash still before being guided through condensers and returning to liquid. The resulting spirit, known as low wines, is forwarded to the spirit still where distillation is repeated. Only the heart of the run, the purest spirit, is collected in the spirit safe, which is kept locked as tax is now due to the government. The clear spirit is poured into oak casks for the long period of maturation. By law, the spirit cannot be called Scotch whisky until it has matured in Scotland for at least 3 years. Many whiskies are matured for much longer. As the spirit matures in the cask, it develops in flavour and acquires its renowned golden colour. Grain whisky, on the other hand, is made using a continuous technique called the patent still process. Grain whisky is made from a mash of malted barley, to which other cereals may have been added, generally wheat or corn. The other cereals are cooked, preparing them for fermentation. the starch cells in the grain burst. The addition of malted barley aids the conversion of starch, ready for fermentation. Distillation is carried out in a patent or coffee still, and the spirit collected at a higher strength than malt whisky. The resulting whisky is also lighter and mellower than malt whisky. Malt and grain whiskies complement each other when combined. Blending was first introduced in Scotland in the 1860s. At that time, malt whisky was seldom left to mature in cask for any length of time. As a result, it was a fiery drink considered too potent for most tastes. Grain whisky had a gentler flavour, and blending malt and grain whiskies together produced a smoother, flavoursome whisky. This innovation saw a boom in whisky consumption, first in England, then throughout the world. Blending requires a considerable amount of skill and is an art that takes years to acquire. Whiskies from many different distilleries are used in a blend, each one carefully selected to complement and enhance the flavour of the other whiskies. The art of the blender is to create a whisky that's recognisable in character and never varies in standard. Quality and consistency are key before bottling and sale as blended Scotch whisky, each one with its own character and distinctive taste.
The distillation process of single grain whisky is carried out in a continuous column still. A column still is such a distillation apparatus which consists of two columns. The impact of distillation by using a column still appears in the form of higher percentage of ABV, alcohol by volume, with less flavorful spirit. This neutral flavor of grain whisky is due to the high ABV level, which makes it a light whisky. The most widely used grain in the manufacturing of single grain whisky is wheat. The next criterion of single grain Scottish whisky is its ingredients used in the manufacturing of this type of whisky. Wheat, corn, maize, rye and unmalted barley are the types of grains which are used for distillation of single grain whisky. By the time being, the numbers of distilleries in Scotland which are making single grain Scottish whisky have been reduced. It does not mean that demand of single grain whisky has been reduced. These are companies' financial matters and some other reasons which have merged the some distilleries in one distillery owned by well-established companies. Currently, only 7 distilleries are making single grain whisky in Scotland. North British Distillery, Cameron Bridge Grain Distillery, Strathclyde Grain Distillery, Invergordon Grain Distillery, Loch Lomond Distillery, Girvan Grain Distillery, Starlaw Distiller. In Ireland, Green Ore is alone in producing single grain whiskies which it makes from corn. Like its Scottish counterparts, the spirit has notes of vanilla and toffee with some spiciness. A handful of producers from other countries, for example, Japan, make single grain whiskies.
This is Green Ore, which is an 8-year-old single grain whisky we're going to taste. Grain spirit is delicate, so it picks up the flavour of the oak cask during maturation very, very well. And we use a lot of bourbon casks. And the bourbon cask gives a typical vanilla sweetness to whisky. And you can smell this in the grain. It's a light whisky, but a light whisky with character, vanilla, a lot of honey as well, and smooth caramel. On the taste again, very smooth, slow build up to that lovely oakiness that you get in the whisky. And then the finish is long, satisfying. Again, the flavour of caramel, chocolate, lingering, and a beautiful finish. Green Ore 8-year-old.
Cheers friends, Have a lovely day.